Well, what we hear today is awesome, as we say. Perhaps my favorite character in all that we've heard, both outside in the car park and here in the church, is actually the donkey. As we enter into Holy Week, we might think of that donkey. He can hardly have known what was going on, but he let himself be taken into it. And, Christ himself, the Son of God, did not refuse the services of a donkey. He rode on the back of a donkey. Well, we all make asses of ourselves, don't we? And yet Christ is ready to ride on us. He wants us to carry him if we can. But today, and especially what we've just heard, the story of our Lord's Passion is too much for us, really. We began with the entry into Jerusalem, so positive, so promising. Here's the Messiah entering Jerusalem, hailed as the King who comes in the name of the Lord. It's the high point, in a sense, of our Lord's life. But then things change so quickly. The hour of darkness, and in the end, Jesus is sealed in a stone-cold tomb, wrapped up in a shroud and left on a limestone shelf in a quarry that had been turned into a cemetery. Well, let's just try and, enter into this account, this passion. Perhaps it's helpful, and I'm not at all being flippant, to think of it as a play. There's the chief character, we know who he is, and around him a whole cast, named and unnamed, from Judas to Joseph of Arimathea, from the high priests to the Roman soldiers. There's a crowing cock, and off stage a veil is torn. The crowds howl, women wail. There's a place called the Skull, and the sky goes dark. Now break down what we've just heard and taken part in, and you find an act with 7 scenes. The Last Supper, the agony in the garden, our Lord's arrest, the trial before the Jewish authorities, the trial before the Roman governor, the crucifixion and death, and then the burial. There's a room, upper room, and a garden, and houses, and courtyards, and finally a tomb. It's hard not to have the feel of a procession, movement through space. There's measurement of time. St. Luke mentions it. Evening, night, daybreak, 6th hour, 9th hour, and the Sabbath approaching. There's a rhythm to it. 3 times Peter denies the Lord. 3 times Jesus is mocked. 3 times Pilate appeals to the crowd. 3 crosses are raised on Golgotha. 3 times Jesus speaks from the cross. So the Passion lends itself, surely, we've just experienced it really, to the metaphor of a play. The Gospels give the first edition, the first, as it were, performance after the reality. The liturgy follows. We know about the mystery plays. The medievals loved to recreate this story. We know how cities in the south still hold Holy Week processions. We know about Mel Gibson and Oberammergau. And what does this play do? Well, we sense it has huge significance. And perhaps as we listen to it, it creates an ache in the heart. An ache, obviously, at the tragedy of what is done to Jesus, but also an ache to understand, to somehow get it, to feel it. Listening, we might feel like someone stretching out their arms to something they can't quite grasp, or think of a domestic animal who knows there is food on the family table, knows it can't jump up, but sits there looking up, pleading, hoping for something to fall or be given. I think that's how we should feel when we listen to the story of the Passion, when we read it. Do we long, shouldn't we long, for this drama, which isn't just past, which is alive and powerful now? Shouldn't we long for it at least to touch us, maybe grab us, shake us, or at least drop something into our soul? Plays, as we know, can be very powerful. A cousin of mine watching a play of Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright, was so affected, spoke to her so much and to her own situation, that at the end she couldn't move and just sat there sobbing in the theatre as it emptied. I had saw the same thing at the Belmont during the winter when the British premiere of the film Sobibor was shown. And at the end, again, someone just broke down and couldn't leave their seat. And a few friends were comforting her. We might think of Mary, who isn't mentioned directly in St. Luke's account, but was there, we know, one of the women from Galilee. What did it mean to watch her flogged and crucified son dying? Talk about trauma. And as darkness came over the land, she, the Immaculate, she, the Mother, she, pure sensitivity. What was done to her that Friday? What changed in her? You can't go through that and be untouched. What happened to her heart and her face? What kind of memory did she carry for the rest of her life? What did everything and everyone else look like after that? Now, strikingly, St. Luke calls the Passion, we heard the word, a spectacle. He uses that metaphor, a theoria. That is something you watch, a show. He writes, when the people who had gathered for the spectacle saw what had happened, they went home beating their breasts. They didn't just see and forget. They saw and were changed. Again, he says, it's all on page 6 of what we were following. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he gave praise to God and said, this was a righteous man. And Jesus' distant, frightened friends and the women disciples saw all this happen. He keeps using this language of vision. And the latter, the women, followed Joseph of Arimathea, and they saw the tomb and the body's positioning. Then they go home, prepare spices and ointment, and rest on the Sabbath. All this seeing happens immediately after Jesus dies. And it happens as a strange divine darkness, the eclipse, that had shrouded Jesus for the last 3 hours of his life must have been lifting. It happens as the candles were being lit for the Sabbath meal in all the homes in Jerusalem. I think it subtly suggests the resurrection. And those seeings that come after Jesus has died, these were different seeings from those of the Sanhedrin or the people who shouted out, crucify him, crucify him. Different seeings from Herod and his cronies making fun of Jesus, or the guards who blindfolded him and were the blind ones themselves. When Jesus turned and looked at Peter after his denial, Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Those tears, we might say, washed the eyes of his soul. So what is this passion about, the passion of the God-man? What can it do for us? What can it do for me? How did Pilate sleep that night? What went through the centurion as he lay on his bed in the barracks afterwards? Who did Peter talk to? Did anyone put an arm around his hunched shoulders that evening? Did Mary? What does the Passion do for us? Does it leave us praising like the centurion, or sobbing, or beating our breasts like the people, or resting and waiting like the holy women, or just numb? What difference does it make to have seen this play, to see it year after year? So, do we see differently now? Have we seen something that can change our seeing of everything and everyone forever? Perhaps we can simply pray, Lord, that I may see.